Now, health officials have hailed the progress being made in South Africa's vaccine drive. Let's now talk about employee rights when it comes to their Covid-19 vaccination choices. Can one choose to refuse to be vaccinated and not face any sort of persecution? And are employees allowed to be forced to inoculate? These are just some of the questions that we'll be asking our guest this afternoon. He is Mr. Osborne Molatudi, labour law expert. Mr. Molatudi, good to have you with us this afternoon on Daytime Update. Perhaps let's start with the most burning question. Can employers force or compel their employees to vaccinate?
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you once again for having me on your show. It's a yes and no. A no in the sense that, firstly, before an employer can force employees to be vaccinated, that employer is required to do a number of things in the workplace. And until such aspects are undertaken, such as undertaking risk assessment, identify which employees are of high risk, which employees will be exposed to members of the public, etc., and thereafter developing a policy which will then make it compulsory for those identified employees to be vaccinated. Then until such time that that is done, an employer may not force an employee to actually take a jab. It's a yes in the sense that once an employer has a mandatory vaccination policy, after it has done the things that I've just mentioned, then yes, the employer can then require its employees to undertake vaccination.
And what then are the rights of the employee in this instance, should they feel that their constitutional rights have been infringed, if for whatever reasons, whether medically or religious reasons, they have chosen not to take the vaccine, and yet obviously they still qualify because they are qualified to do the job at hand?
Indeed, those employees have every constitutional right to say no. And one of that right is contained, I think, in Section 12, subsection 2, which relates to bodily integrity. And also, the employee may refuse on religious grounds, as well as citing invasion of privacy. So they do have the right to say no, to be forced to undertake a vaccination. However, there are consequences for such a refusal.
And take us through the possible consequences that are, I guess, within the law and outside of the law that an employer may then decide to make use of.
Yes, so in terms of the direction that has been published very recently, I think sometime in June this year, once an employer has done an overhaul and a comprehensive risk assessment of its workplace and has identified employees who may be of high risk or be exposed to members of the public. I mean, think about your flight attendants, think about your tellers, your cashiers, all those people who may be exposed to members of the public. And once the employer has done a risk assessment in respect of that category of employees, and then forms a view that they be vaccinated and they refuse, and I know I differ with my other colleagues, in my view, the employer can in fact terminate their services for operational requirements, because the employer has an obligation to maintain a working environment, and therefore that employer may not be settled with employees who may pose a risk to members of public that are to be served by that employer. Other colleagues, or they say it's arguable that the employees may also be dismissed for refusing to obey with the employer's policy, in other words, breaching the employer's policy. For me, that would be a very big challenge if one is simply dismissed for breaching an employer's policy, when that person would have refused on constitutional basis for undertaking vaccination. The best shot for the employer, in my view, is operational requirements, to say, I'm unable to continue conducting the business with you because I cannot accommodate you. You are in a higher risk area, and I haven't found any alternatives for you. Therefore, I'm terminating your employment for operational requirements. The other option is for those employees that are identified as having underlying medical conditions etc., those employees may be terminated for incapacity. But I must emphasize, Tammy, that these things are not things that can be done overnight. Employers have to go through a comprehensive process before they can even make a decision on termination. And one of which is the risk assessment, send employees for medical counseling, sending employees for medical further assessment to check if there's no contraindication of that which makes them to refuse. And if employees is found to have, my view, should be terminated for operational requirements. In other words, retrench or for incapacity. But for misconduct, I think it will be challenging for the employers to justify that.
You've spoken now really from the side of the employer, giving them all the loopholes that they can use in order to dismiss their employees. Let's turn let's put the shoe in the other foot for a moment and look at the positives and the advantages that an employee has and what basis they may use for an argument to still retain their employment.
Yes, indeed. An employee may say, as an alternative, please make me work from home or put me in a site where I don't have to be in contact with members of the public, accommodate me as much as you can, and until such time that you cannot find alternatives to accommodate me, then I would agree with you that then either I take the vaccine or then I run the risk of being terminated for operational requirements. I've given you an example of a flight attendant. Can you imagine a flight attendant refusing to be vaccinated, and yet that flight attendant wants to do his or her job and fly to other countries, etc.? She won't be allowed entry if she can't produce a vaccination certificate. And unfortunately, that is an operational requirement. It has got nothing to do with the employer to say, no, this employer is just getting rid of us because we are saying no. So there are those employees that can be accommodated in the form of working from home or off-site, etc. But until such time that those alternatives are exhausted, then an employer, will have difficulty in terminating their employment.
Mr. Molatudi, we have to end our time here for today, but thank you for that very comprehensive scenario that you posted, as well as the possible options. But I do foresee a lot of legal slippery slopes along the way as far as this is concerned. This really is just the beginning of this entire dialogue that not only South Africa needs to have, but the world is having as we speak. Thank you for your time and your insight. That's Mr. Osborne Molatudi, a labor law expert. Now, we'll be flipping the coin and looking at the other side of this argument. When we return, we'll be joined by the spokesperson, or the Gauteng Commission head for the South African Human Rights Commission, Boang Jones, and we'll be discussing this particular issue, as well as discrimination that might arise in places of accommodation where workers who are living in a communal area were being pressured to take vaccinations, and that's an issue that the South African Human Rights Commission has been working on. We'll update you in just a moment.